Hey guys, Mr. Klein here with our third and our last lesson in our chapter on our African empires. So we've already talked about the Ghana Empire, we've talked about the Mali Empire, and now we're going to talk about the Songhai Empire, all of whom, of course, built their wealth on trade of salt. Now, I know, like by now, you're like, Mr. Klein, can we please stop talking about salt? Okay, I'm just kind of getting salty here. So I promise you, it's like the last one, we're going to talk about salt for a while. So let's go ahead and let's get started with this. Who exactly were the Songhai people? One of the kingdoms in West Africa that were conquered by the Mali were known as the Songhai, who were a group of people who lived in the Sahel, which you remember was those dry grasslands that bordered on the Sahara Desert. Now, the Songhai people are still around. For example, here's a picture of the guy who is a member of the Songhai ethnic group. Now, the Songhai at the time controlled a really small empire. It was called the Gao Empire, which was at the end of the long Saharan trade route. So this is where they got out of the deserts, and this was the first place where they transferred goods. While Gao flourished under Mali rule, if you remember from the last lesson, the Mansas after Mansa Musa and Suleiman Keita did not do a really good job of managing the finances, so it kind of went broke. So as a result, the Songhai was like, look, we don't need your mismanagement. We can do this better ourselves. And so they became independent of the Mali in the 1380s, and the Songhai Empire was then born, which we'll go into the next part. So in order to understand how the Songhai got, so big and so wealthy, we need to talk about who actually founded it and the founder of the Songhai Empire. The Songhai initially were actually really quite weak. I mean, they weren't very big. They were at the edge of the Saharan trade routes, and they were really only involved with trade as not so much military power. While they had control, like I said, of the trade routes exiting Sahara, those trade routes actually went through the Gao Empire all the way to the great city of Timbuktu, which is in a neighboring kingdom. Now, the city of Timbuktu, of course, is like in history, and if you watch any of those old Bugs Bunny things, like, oh my God, you're gone to Timbuktu. Sounds like it's in the middle of nowhere, but actually it was a really big trade center. And the thing is, though, the rulers of Timbuktu were unable to fight off the Tuareg tribe who was attacking trade caravans. Now, of course, whenever we're talking about the Tuareg, not that Tuareg, that's a Volkswagen Tuareg. No, we're talking about these Tuaregs, okay? Yeah, those nomads who lived in the Sahara deserts and have a long history of nomadic life and tribal warfare. They were attracting trade caravans. Now, the Songhai king by the name of Sunni Ali defeated the Tuaregs, and then he got like a really good idea. Why don't we just take Timbuktu for ourselves? And so that's what they did. They went ahead and they conquered Timbuktu themselves in 1468. Now, after they did that, they then laid siege to the Mali trade center of Djenné, which, if you remember from the last lesson, was like one of the big trade centers in the Mali Empire. They had taken the two most important trading cities in West Africa. And as a result, the Songhai Empire actually became wealthier than even the Mali Empire. You remember, the Mali Empire was pretty wealthy. And as the Songhai really took control of all of these trade centers, and they got involved with those taxes and trades like the Ghana and Mali did, they became even more wealthy. And we're going to see how the Songhai Empire got even bigger in the next session. Songhai Empire really only got really cooking and really got big under the rule of their most famous ruler, Askia the Great. Now, traditionally, West African kings didn't have like what we normally think of as lines of succession for monarchs, where the eldest child, usually the son, takes over after the monarch dies. Rather, what ended up happening was the uncle transferred power to the oldest nephew. However, Askia the Great, the greatest king of the Songhai Empire, wasn't even a member of the noble class. Let's stop right here and let's go over our graphic organizer for the lesson, because since we're talking about nobles, we need to talk about the social pyramid of the Songhai Empire. Now, the Songhai was an ethnic group. They always preferred members of their own ethnic group over foreigners. So whenever it came to social organization, if you were a Songhai person, you were preferred over someone who was an outsider. So always keep that in mind. Now, the Songhai social pyramid, they were actually a lot like ancient India and the Hindus in that they had a caste system. So if you were born as a goat herder, you died as a goat herder. And if your father was a goat herder, I don't care if you wanted to be a rocket scientist. Guess what you were going to be when you grew up? That's right, a goat herder. So let's go into each of these. At the top, of course, were the nobles, okay? These are your kings, your princes, and stuff like that. Below them were traders, which really makes sense in context of these West African empires. The only reason why they had power was because of wealth through trade. So traders were really highly respected and they were really important in Songhai society. Below them were the craftsmen, the people who made the stuff, which were traded. Below them, of course, were the farmers who provided the food. And finally, at the bottom, of course, were slaves. Now, Askia, as a warrior, was somewhere between traders and nobles because he was a general. So let's talk about how he became the king of the Songhai Empire. Now, his name wasn't actually Askia. His name was actually known as Muhammad Ture. Askia was a general in the Songhai army under rule of Sunni Ali's son, Sunni Baru. Ture, if you remember, by this time, most of West Africa was Muslim, and so Ture said that Baru was not a good Muslim. As a result, he wasn't fit to be rule of the Songhai Empire. It's like, look, we're a Muslim kingdom. You're not a good Muslim. You can't be the king. Now, by 1493, Ture defeated Baru as now king of the Songhai. In fact, he got so big and famous, he's a playable character in Civilization. You know, look, you get receive triple gold when you take over the barbarian. Now, over the next 30 years of Askia's rule, Askia made the Songhai Empire the largest nation in one of the largest nations in Africa's long history. So you got even bigger than the Mali. Now, as you can see right here, it took over all this area. In fact, it even stretched into the trade routes of the Sahara. And, you know, with an empire this big, obviously they're going to do some awesome things, which let's talk about here. So since the Songhai Empire was so big and so wealthy, obviously you had a lot of awesome things going on, especially under the rule of Askia the Great. And that's where the Songhai Empire reached its height. You know, and the Songhai Empire, by the way, only lasted about 100 years. So 30 years of it was, you know, Askia the Great being in charge. Now, under his rule, the Songhai grew to take over most of the major salt mines under Mali control, as well as the trade centers across most of the shrinking Mali Empire. So as the Songhai grew, the Mali Empire shrunk down lower because they were taking away all of their wealth. So these trade centers, and by this time, this was the West African trade routes, crossing through the Sahara Desert, in from southern West Africa, even into Central Africa, and going across the Egypt, the Sudan, Ethiopia. So, you know, these trade centers in West Africa had all this trade and they were collecting all this money. Now, speaking of trade, properly governed this. Askia appointed able administrators who standardized and collected taxes. He said, okay, all tax in my empire, they're all going to be the same. He standardized the court system, established the standard weights and measures to make trade fair for all parties, including these salt traders here. So everything was legalized and proper, what we would think of as trade being fair. Okay, the price is this much, you're paying this much. Just because you live in you're working in another town or something, the price isn't going to be different. The weights aren't going to be different, which makes trade really easier for everyone involved. Now, like Mansa Musa, of course, he was a devout Muslim. He completed a Hajj as well. But unlike Mansa Musa, he brought money, but not enough to wreck the entire gold economy of North Africa. Now, upon returning, the Songhai had a system of universities and astronomical observatories set up and staffed by Muslim scholars across Africa whom Askia hired to come over. He's like, look, come over, create our universities, teach Islam, teach science, teach math. And so these are actually manuscripts from what we found in trading centers in Timbuktu and stuff like that of these old Muslim universities. Here's some mathematical and observations of outer space and stuff based on what the astronomers did. But of course, all good things come to an end, which we'll talk about in our last section here. What generally happens with a ruler, a really great ruler, is they rule really well, really wise, and the land's pretty good. But the problem usually is they don't really have a really good successor. And that's the same thing with Askia the Great. He got older, his hold over the empire declined, and his sons ended up kicking him out in order to take power. Without a strong leader, the Songhai Empire rapidly declined. And even Askia the Great, after he passed away, they buried him in this tomb here, which is now next to a mosque, and it's actually a site dedicated and preserved by the UN because it's a great example of West African architecture and also, you know, in honor of the rule of Askia the Great. With him dead and his sons mismanaging, several civil wars erupted soon afterward. Now, this caused a problem with trade, okay? because so the trade was disrupted between North and West Africa, and the Kingdom of Morocco, who benefited the most from this trade, swiftly invaded in order to take advantage of this chaos, save the trade routes, and restore the flow of gold and salt and the money. What ended up happening was traditionally warfare in West Africa consisted of cavalry charges with stampeding cattle, archers, and spearmen. If you remember, in West Africa, because they kind of developed on their own, advanced weapons and stuff at this time in history were a little unknown in West Africa. So here's your spearmen. They also had horsemen. They had horse cavalry, but the vast majority of soldiers were archers and spearmen. This leads to issues when you take on an enemy with more advanced technology in you, as we'll see what causes the actual complete and total collapse of the Songhai Empire. The Moroccans, however, were armed with firearms and cannons. Now, by this time, this is in the 1500s, so this is after Columbus has sailed across the Atlantic and the Spanish have their empire and stuff. The Renaissance has already taken place. There's firearms and there's cannons, and European warfare is completely changing, and the days of the armored knight are pretty much done. At the Battle of Tondibi in 1591, a force of only 4,500 Moroccans faced off against the Songhai Empire's army, with over 20,000 men. Now, thanks in part to the sound of the Moroccan guns causing the Songhai cattle stampede to turn around and rush back into the Songhai soldiers, the Moroccans were able to win easily. And with this advanced technology, you ended up having such a lopsided battle that there was nothing that the Songhai could do about it. You couldn't match the firepower. Plus, whenever you have this cattle stampede racing through, that becomes a really big issue, which if you don't think like stampeding cattle and stuff are a really big deal, don't you remember the Lion King? Like, look at Simba's face, okay? If you got, each of these weighs about a ton, okay, charging into you, obviously, with hundreds of them, that's really dangerous and you're going to die. So, like, running away from it is a really, really wise thing to do. So go ahead and let's wrap up this lesson here. The Songhai Empire was ruled by the Songhai people. They're still an ethnic group around in West Africa. At the time of the Songhai Empire, they ruled a small area at the Sahel, which was the exit of the Sahara Desert. Under the rule of Sunni Ali, they took over the trade center of Timbuktu. But they reached the height of their power under the rule of Askia the Great. Now, the important thing to know about Askia the Great was that he wasn't a member of the nobles, the highest caste of the Songhai Empire. Despite this, under his wise rule, the Songhai Empire became really, really big. In fact, bigger than any of the other empires we looked at in West Africa. When he died, they created a really big tomb for him, but unfortunately, under his rule, the rule of his successors rather, the Songhai Empire fell apart really quickly. Mainly because technology kind of passed them up. Because if you remember, these soldiers of West Africa were mainly unarmored spearmen, and whenever they took on the firearm wielding Moroccans at the Battle of Tondibi, the technological advance, they were no match for it, and they quickly fell apart. The empire was taken over, and that kind of ends the golden age of West Africa. So, there you go. That's your lesson on the Songhai Empire. Hope you enjoyed it. And if, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.